He is a visiting professor at the Department of Medieval Studies and History Department at Central European University. Professor received his PhD degree in history from the Ohio State University. His main areas of research and teaching include early modern Ottoman political, dynastic, and social history, 17th century global crisis, military history, and historical network research. Currently, he's finishing his new book about the factions and favorites at the Ottoman imperial court, as well as continuing to work on his long-term project on the networks of power and patronage among the Ottoman ruling elite in the 16th and 17th century. I wish all of you good luck, and Professor Berekci, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carolina. I should only add one thing, that I am also very much interested in the historical movie making and series making, and I worked as a consultant for a couple of shows. So this conference is truly great, and I'm really very much thankful to all of you who organized this. And I welcome you all for this panel. It's a distinct pleasure of mine to introduce three of our speakers. We will start with Professor Nuria Corral Sánchez from University of Salamanca. Professor Sánchez is an assistant professor at Universidad Isabel I and a researcher at the group Society, Power, and Culture in the Crown of Castile at University of Salamanca. She has some experience as a secondary teacher in history as well. Professor Sánchez got her PhD in medieval history at University of Salamanca, I think in December 2019, thanks to a predoctoral national grant for 4 years. During this period, she has made some research stays at different European universities, such as Sorbonne. Her research interests are focused on social and political relations in late medieval society from the perspectives of communication and discourse. Apart from several papers and book chapters on these topics, she has recently published her first book, a monograph entitled Discourses Against Noblemen in Late Medieval Castile, which is based on her PhD thesis. Today, we are going to listen her talk on the topic of Rethinking the Middle Ages, Didactic Proposals Around Audiovisual Culture. I personally look forward to your talk, Professor Sánchez, and the floor is yours.
Thank you all of you, and congratulations for the event and the logistics. Thank you for all your work, and thank you, of course, for having me here. Do you listen to me well?
Just we listen to you, and we don't see you, but if you have your...
I wanted to share my screen. I tried to...
you're a co-host, so you should be able to.
I think, do you see it?
Yeah,
it's
perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so yes, this is my proposal today. Rethinking the Middle Ages, didactic proposals around audiovisual culture. In the 21st century, our society usually approaches to history from audiovisual culture and from audiovisual culture, moving further away from written sources. The results of this trend are shown in two ways: the opportunity to offer the historical knowledge to the masses and the threat that such knowledge will be biased and misleading. Bearing this in mind, we have carried out a teaching project that allows us to tackle these issues in the subject History 1, which belonged to the first year of the degrees in art history and geography at the University of Salamanca in Spain. My aim in this project, or in my following research, was to try to understand the way films and also TV series and video games affect our perception of the past, in particular the Middle Ages. I wanted to answer the question, what do they convey about medieval societies and how do they do it? I also encourage my students to make a reflexive and active approach to these matters. The contents of this paper will be, after this brief introduction, a theoretical approach about the audiovisual media as a way to history focusing on the Middle Ages, of course. Then the third point will be my project entitled The Middle Ages in the Media Age. And finally, a kind of conclusion that I will summarize. The production of historical films has proved profitable and popular. Since the 90s, televisions and also contributes to the dissemination of historical images. Recently, even streaming services have increased this offer. Obviously, the study of film is quite recent in the cultural and historical analysis. From the 70s onward, the emphasis of the researchers have shifted from the accumulation of data and interpretations of specific works to the cultural impact and receptions of these productions, with works like those by Landy, Rosenstone, or Pierre Sorlin that you can see on the screen. For Rosenstone, the historical film is history as vision, and visual media are a valid way of representing and thinking about the past, but with its own rules. He explains that for us there are many ways to write history, and there are many ways to film history, and many ways to read history on the page or on the screen. In a similar way, the director Robert Bresson suggested that le cinéma n'est pas un spectacle, c'est une écriture. Cinema is not a spectacle, it is a writing. Instead of comparing the screen to the page, these so-called postmodernist authors questioned how do films produce a historical world. However, we have to consider other viewpoints, like some by authors who defend that if history becomes a vision or an opinion, there is no way to arrive at the truth. Marshall, Landy, Hahn, and also Eliot have warned that recent profession of historical films or series could obstruct our ability to discriminate and examine the events represented on the screen. According to Marshall Landy, the insistence on accuracy is the major obstacle in inviting a proper assessment of the uses of the past in cinema. In place of the standards of judgment about truth or falsehood, she thinks that film scholars and historians need to pool their knowledge and work together to make new methods for understanding history through images. In any case, even if films are based on real historical events, they must be evaluated differently than scholarly books, according to John Abbott, as their main goal is not to educate, but to entertain. These perspectives lead us to consider films and TV series as worthy didactic tools in history courses. Although some medievalists, like David Herlihy, have argued that films should not be an integral part of historians' teaching. His main objective was that movies create a make-believe world where viewers are required to suspend their critical judgment. On the contrary, Albrecht considers that films provide an exciting and engaging method of illustrating projects to students in the classroom and to the public at large. On this matter, we think that it is important to encourage our society, in this case, our students, to carry out a reflexive analysis of visual productions. This section cannot conclude without mention of video games. Regarding to this, theoretical positions are similar. Thus, due to our limited time, I excuse to expand on their relation to history studied by authors like Chapman or Martin Wainwright. What about the Middle Ages? The medieval period is considered one of the most difficult eras of history for modern audiences and filmmakers to imagine. On a superficial level, we are served up stories of knights in shining armor rescuing damsels in distress, or very contradictory images of barbaric cruelty and superstitious ignorance. Of course, Neither extreme can hardly begin to communicate the experience of what it was like to live during the Middle Ages. To penetrate the medieval mentality, one must engage a whole different set of assumptions and ways of looking at the world than our own. However, for John Abbott, even a bad film can have its lesson for how the medieval past is colored and distorted by our modern lens. So it is significant to identify not only what is inaccurate, but especially why it is. Usually, films are inaccurate for a reason, in order to pursue the plot, to pursue a political agenda, and occasionally to make the films supposedly more meaningful for the public. A medieval film is usually made because their creators have a real interest in the Middle Ages. However, some authors have recognized certain films that present the medieval subject with a malicious intent. When we talk about medieval representations on cinema, we face another problem. There is a connection between some epic fantasy fiction and the Middle Ages. Novels like The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien were the precedents of this trend, now invigorated by creations like A Song of Ice and Fire, later Game of Thrones by George Martin. Both works were transformed into films or series that became two worldwide phenomena. Fantasy authors usually get inspiration from European culture and society of the Middle Ages, taking some concepts such as knighthood. Thus, some studies on these issues have considered fantasy fiction to analyze the representations of the Middle Ages on the screen, like this collection of essays reunited by Driver and Sid Gray. Having all this in mind, I designed the didactic project, The Middle Ages in the Media Age, an initiative based in three principal parts. The first two were mandatory activities, while the third one was optional. I had 51 degree students, as you can see, from 18 to 60 years old in the academic year 2018 and 2019. These were the main activities. First, brainstorming. The second one was clips for a debate, and the third one was a kind of research and presentation. First, the brainstorming. The brainstorming was based in the question, which is the first word that comes to mind when you think of Middle Ages. So the students had to write that first word in a paper note, and some note paper had more than one answer, so I only considered the first word. I liked very much this one that on the photograph that says the Middle Ages are an era of darkness, of feudalism and relapse, with little or non-existent involvement of the lower social class. So it's fantastic. It has everything that we have to fight for against. So, and these were the ideas that I collected about the Middle Ages in these note papers. So we have ideas related to welfare, to the social political systems, to culture, and religion, fantasy, and negative ideas in general, illness, ignorance, everything. We see here that the main word, or the protagonists, were castles. Castles were, I think there were 5 castles and 1 walls, but okay. Defensive buildings, so I considered them together. After these fortifications, we had feudalism, obvious, and monarchy and kings. And after that, we found the second protagonist was the Black Death. So, and this was in 2019. So if it were today, we would find a lot of Black Death more. Okay. So the second activity was clips for a debate, and it was the analysis of some fragments of films and TV series in the classroom. I made a guide to help the analysis and to provoke the discussion, and this guide was later provided to the students. The final questions I wanted to get were: what image of the Middle Ages is presented, and is it an accurate fiction, or is it useful to know the context, to know history? I presented a fragment from The Warlord that I entitled New Lord in Normandy. I have not read the video, it wasn't available now, so we can see it. This was the guide of analysis, the location and chronology, who were the protagonists, the social context, geopolitical context about Normandy, of course, the economical system, about feudalism, and the accuracy of the film. Then we had this fragment of Disney's Robin Hood, where a group formed by peasants, clergy, and nobility sings a protest song against Prince John Lackland. It's in Spanish because it was the video that I used in the class, in the lesson, so I'm not going to stop here with the guide of analysis, the same location and chronology, the protagonist, context, the critical discourse against the regent and defense of the king, complaints for taxes, taxes that were implemented to reinforce the monarchy, actually. The third theme was The Name of the Rose, very famous one, to show the monastic culture in a Benedictine abbey in the 14th century. This is the scene when William of Baskerville and Nuts of Milk went to the library, and they read some interesting books, like Beato de Liébana book. Beato, here we have Beato. So like, my students were from the degree of art history, and they are very interested in Beatos. So I find it very interesting for them and very, very rich to analyze. So we have biology books, also monastic culture. Here, the guide of analysis too. It was significant, and the Greek was used sporadically, and its use was strange. They say it in the fragment. And finally, I showed a fragment of the TV series Isabel. It is a Spanish TV series about Isabella I of Castile. And when the court takes a loyalty oath to Princess Juana, and some noblemen spread the rumor of her illegitimate birth. So we can see here how Juan Pacheco, here, this is Juan Pacheco, the antagonist of the series, names the baby La Beltraneja, referring to Beltrán de la Cueva, Count of Ledesma, that was meant to be Juana's real father and not the king, Henry IV. Let's see where he says that here, in Spanish, of course. No, it was here. So I thought that it was a very interesting series or video, because it shows the political context, of course, and the relevance of legitimacy in the creation of a modern monarchy, and the protocols and hierarchies in the Castilian court in the 15th century. The third activity was the research and exposition of a poster. They had to make a poster about an audiovisual product that represented a medieval society or whose plot was related to the Middle Ages. So 13 students chose this optional activity, and in summer we organized a public exhibition with the best works in collaboration with the university. These are some of the works about Jane of Arc, The Seventh Seal, the film, Disney's Middle Ages, and Quest for Camelot, also the vision of Middle Ages in that film. And of course, as I expected, I had some works on fantasy, Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones especially, but also a more original one, this influence of medieval knight in Jedi Knight. So this student looked for similarities between these kind of knights and the influences that can be underlined between those realities, or those the fiction of Star Wars and the reality, the medieval reality. And we had some video games work too, this medieval influence in video games about fantasy, of course, but also historical video game, and with a conclusion about if it was a Middle Ages, a medieval period presented in a positive or a negative way. So it was a very interesting work, this one. This is a picture from the press of the exhibition in summer. And finally, students made a self-evaluation of the activities, and they put a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 for their satisfaction with the activity. And we see in general all the activities were well valued. However, we can see a few differences. The most successful one was clips for a debate. So the use of films and series as a didactical tool was highly evaluated. On the other hand, we have some discrepancies in the creation of posters that can be explained because only 13 students out of 51 chose this activity. So they showed a different involvement. Finally, they agree that they would recommend these activities for their history courses. And to conclude, to sum up, historical films are not obviously scholar studies and they cannot replace them. Nevertheless, they have an enormous influence within society. Considered either a vision of history or an entertaining product, the truth is that films determine a collective image of the Middle Ages, even if it comes from epic fantasy fictions, as we have seen. Therefore, audiovisual creations should not be ignored by historians or academics. In spite of some opinions, they must have their place in classrooms, where students could learn different methods to analyze not only the films themselves, but also the representations of the Middle Ages created. Thanks to the project, The Middle Ages in the Media Age, students questioned their own beliefs and several widespread clichés. They had to think and debate about them in practical lessons, where some fragments of films and series were analyzed in common. Then they faced the prevailing representation and the popular ideas about the medieval society to the academic bibliography. Their autonomous work involved an accurate research, the analysis of at least one product, and the design of a poster with the main conclusions. In a significant number of cases, their efforts resulted in relevant reflections and attractive contributions on the constructed Middle Ages. At the end of the project, the majority of our students were capable of examining of examining cultural products that affect the collective perceptions. In this regard, they perfectly understood how medieval and even fantasy fictions create depictions of the Middle Ages that have a greater impact on their social beliefs. To sum up, we recognize the convenience of historical themes in mainly two ways. First, to reach larger publics that usually do not access to historical writings, and second, to support the teaching process with audiovisual material, helping to visualize aspects of the past societies. In any case, those ways should be complemented when possible by a critical discussion of the representations received, especially in academic context. And I would like to finish my talk, if I have time, with this friendly reminder by Pierre Sorlin. If the scholars of the past had not accomplished their enormous task, there would be no positive history, no scientific history. But if historians today neglect audiovisual material, it will exist in spite of them as a history through pictures. Furthermore, the public will lose all interest in specialists. Historians must take an interest in the audiovisual world if they are not to become schizophrenics rejected by society as the representatives of an outmoded erudition. And this is my bibliography. So thank you. This is everything.
Thank you so much, Professor Sánchez. This was really very illuminating, and I had taught so many years medieval history to undergraduate students in Turkey. And guess what? This was exactly the question I always ask in my first class. You know, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? And it's the same: knights, walls, war, and Black Death. So it's universal how kids imagine. And now we will have our second talk by Marija Blaskovic from University of Vienna. Dr. Blaskovic received her PhD in Castilian, did her PhD in Castilian heroic epic with the title Court Society and the Cantar de Mio Cid between 2015 and 2018 at the University of Vienna. Since April 2019, she has been doing a postdoc at the University of Vienna, Department of Romance Studies. Her monograph was published by Iberoamericana in 2020 under the title Polyphonic Potentials, the Nobility of Cantar de Mio Cid. Her articles cover a wide range of topics, including Latin and Romance historiography, 12th to 14th centuries, the interplay of gender, otherness, and power, as well as narrativization of the past, nuances in royal depictions, and memory construction. Today, Dr. Blaskovic will give a talk entitled Benefits and Limitations of Multifaceted Self-referentiality in Galavant. I managed to say it in one single word. It's a pleasure to have you, Marija, if I may call. The floor is yours. Thank you so much, by the way, Dr. Sánchez, for keeping the time around 22 minutes. So Marija, if you can also present your paper within that time limit, that will be great for us. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually timed myself, so that shouldn't be a problem, but my internet connection is a bit breaking, so I will turn the camera off while I'm presenting because I have some clips that I would like to show. And let me just see if you can see my PowerPoint. It's on, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you for having me, and apologies for the mouthful title. I became aware of it earlier this morning. So how powerful TV can be as a tool for shaping perception is evident when suspension of belief and other notions of fiction need to be underlined when dealing with historically important characters. One recent example is Netflix refusing to add a disclaimer to The Crown. So what happens when an audiovisual representation is openly not interested in an accurate reconstruction of historical reality, but actually represents a mashup of what Bert has amusingly called schmedievalism? After working on Disney's Tangled and the ABC sitcom The Neighbors, the award-winning screenwriters and composers teamed up to create the musical fantasy TV comedy Galavant, which received positive reviews, and it was described as owing a strong debt to Monty Python. The two-season TV series was a mid-season replacement for a fantasy drama Once Upon a Time. The series was mostly shot in the UK, and the orchestrations were recorded in LA. The first season was billed as a 4-week comedy extravaganza, and even the title, which is also the hero's name, is an allusion to the word Galavant, which implies going from place to place, seeking out entertainment and amusement. In terms of genre, it is a hybrid. It's a medieval fantasy epic musical set out in the 13th century, but with a modern take and often keen on breaking the fourth wall. The story begins medias in res, and the theme song mentions the valiant knight. Everybody celebrates him, although we do not really know what adventures he has had. The protagonist is a hero and a knight, yet there is no lineage to be proud of. In his own words, he's a self-made hero. Despite his fame, he lives a modest life in search of adventures. He has a squire named Sid and is happy and in love with a fair lady named Madalena, who is then kidnapped by King Richard. So this is all in the theme song. So let's just see what happens at the very beginning of the show.
Because here's the thing. I love her, Richard. She's the first thing I think of in the morning, and the last thing I think of in the eve. And you can offer her great fame, and you can offer her great fortune, but only I can offer her great love. And that is what she chooses.
Actually... I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about it ever since he kidnapped me, and... I'm gonna go with the fame and fortune. Seems like an easier life, you know? Oh, I'm really sorry, Gal. Hope we can be friends.
Hold that thought, darling. Good night, sweet prince. Damn it, Gareth, would you just do that for me, please?
Night, night.
Okay, I don't know if the video was a bit choppy, but I hope the sound was good enough. So the subversion of tropes, valiant knight, fair lady, evil king, they all take place at the very beginning. Madalena is no longer the fair lady, damsel in distress she seemed to be. Also, Richard is shown from a different angle. He's set in a lavish atmosphere, and he enjoys all the royal privileges, yet he needs to be constantly entertained and humored. So in a way, he's just as self-absorbed as Galavant. However, Richard is convinced that Madalena is a virgin, so he respects her vow and conquers the kingdom of Valencia to please her. Madalena is the only one with power now, and she cleverly uses Galavant's fame to torture Richard until he gets her the famous Valencian jewel. Galavant, in turn, is now a wreck, but he accepts an offer to help Princess Isabella Maria Lucia Elisabetta of Valencia because she tells him that Madalena is missing him. What he doesn't know is that Isabella is being forced into this deceit in order to save her parents. All the while, she's tormented by her dilemma, but since she's excellent at wielding a sword, she turns into a trainer and motivator for the out-of-shape Galavant. The theme song provides a fast-forward version of the story, but the plot development has a slow pace. During the first season, the princess, heir to the throne turned damsel in distress, helps Galavant win probably the worst joust in his life, yet ironically falls in love with him. And he seems to be on board as well. Madalena seems to like Richard at first, but then she gets tired of his childish behavior, and he fails to impress her. He tries to be manly and funny, but nothing seems to work. After several misadventures, including pirates, Galavant and Isabella make it to Valencia only to end up imprisoned, as well as Richard, until the King's Guard and his best friend Gareth releases them all, but they all end up in different kingdoms. Gareth is now with Madalena, and Isabella is literally imprisoned until the wedding to her young cousin from the neighboring kingdom, therefore assuming the position of the damsel in distress Madalena had at the beginning of the season. The second season has the knight-errant model, which is always good since it creates opportunities to have all kinds of encounters and adventures, only this time male-male bonding is at the forefront. Galavant helps Richard take his kingdom back so they can save Isabella from the unwanted marriage. So Galavant is again motivated by love. Madalena briefly goes from queen consort to queen regent, but still chooses power and dark magic over love. In fact, while magic makes Madalena more powerful, the effect on Isabella is to have her mind controlled by an evil wedding planner. They all meet again when Madalena and Gareth decide to invade the kingdom of Isabella's fiancé, and Galavant and Richard come to her rescue. When it comes to the benefits or potentials from the perspective of literary or cultural studies, the most obvious approach is the subversion of archetypes and tropes. Some of them are universal, some are more typical of medieval works. For example, Madalena turns into a powerful royal figure, while Isabella goes from being a damsel in distress to a princess warrior and a military leader. Her Valencian origin and the scenes shot in Morocco already place her in the realm of foreign and exotic. Her image, therefore, is reminiscent of the trope of the Saracen princess warrior or the myth of female warriors of the Amazon, which was also propagated in the Middle Ages. Galavant is close to the Disney Prince Charming, but also to the knight in shining armor and to the Juvenis from medieval romances, since he is a landless knight that relies on adventures to obtain fame. King Richard's image contains some Arthurian elements, such as a sword in a stump, or the potion he takes from Merlin's replacement, the magician named Xanax. When it comes to the evolution of the figures, Madalena goes down the downward spiral. Surprisingly, Galavant and Isabella remain quite static in the second season, and Richard has the strongest evolution, from being untouched by war and women, as his brother describes him, to dealing with an identity crisis. From the gender perspective, several observations can be made. Madalena and Isabella turn into arch-enemies, taking therefore the places of Richard and Galavant, and these two are now forced to do the so-called buddy trip. This is comparable to the companionship well established in heroic epic, such as the one between Roland and Olivier. But they are actually not on the battlefield, and they are not powerful. They lack manpower, they lack wealth, and they lack allies. This way, they are quite an unusual pair, and there is almost something Don Quixotesque about them. And in their isolation, a friendship develops. The agency of both women is initially reduced by men and then mostly affected by magic, enhancing power for Madalena and diminishing it in Isabella's case. However, they do not bond with other figures unless they fall in love, and they do not have companions. By contrast, male bonding is not limited to Richard and Galavant, but also explored via Richard and Gareth, his best friend, and also with Galavant and his squire Sid. Finally, without revealing too much, one character decides to save Madalena, quote unquote, from herself, therefore imposing the damsel in distress framework back onto her and turning himself into a man on a quest. In relation to subverting literary tropes, we have servants that are usually employed to parody the couples from the higher strata and their love, especially in comedies. Here, in this case, they are not only the only ones with true and consistent values, but their knowledge on herbs and potions also affects the storyline. The series is a hybrid in terms of genres, but we often ignore that we are the ones who make and use these categories. And there are many examples of hybrid heroes and their stories in the Middle Ages. Some of them are more in line with the warrior image dominated by physical violence. Others need to reconcile the opposing interests of arma versus amores. Some images contain hagiographical undertones, and so on. Discursive polyphony existed back then, so this is something to be reminded of when analyzing these works. Similar to this, self-referentiality has a long history, whether it concerns the veracity of the sources, the use of irony, or even self-irony. For instance, when Chrétien's Lancelot finds the queen's comb with some hairs left in it, he is so overwhelmed with emotions and treats the hair like something sacred. Or when Wolfram von Eschenbach refers to Arthur in Eternal Springtime setting as a way to criticize Chrétien's incoherencies. Troubadours were also loud critics of royals and nobles who would fall out of the scope of prescribed virtues, so self-awareness and critique provide valuable points of comparison. Finally, the concept of hero. All the way from the Epic of Gilgamesh to ancient Greek and Roman versions to errant knights, grail seekers, to modern versions such as superheroes and nerds or losers with special powers, this concept is ever-changing. The inclusion of a self-aware protagonist helped to deconstruct the concept, whether by absurd warnings such as the hero doesn't talk, or deciding not to start a quest on a Wednesday because it is unheard of. It is a good reminder that heroic accounts are not to be taken at face value and to focus more on the underlying patterns and tendencies in hero depictions and memory construction. Among the topics more limited to the Middle Ages are some legal aspects, such as trials by combat, pulling a man's beard, issues of power and legitimacy, such as endogamic marriages, the right to ascend the throne, the vassalage, and the internal topic of loyalty. The show also includes the perspective of servants and squires at some point, especially when Galavant and his squire Sid change places, so this provides additional insight. Interestingly, sexuality is employed often enough. Richard is a virgin, and he is a contrast to Madalena's sudden and insatiable appetite for sex. Although, unlike medieval chronicles that tended to diminish and disqualify female authority by using sex, in Madalena's case, she is not disruptive. When it comes to intermediality, the performative aspect is at the forefront of the show. Musicals are by default self-aware genres, and the songs stand in for inner monologues or have a foreshadowing function. There are important guest appearances, such as the wizard named Xanax and Weird Al, who appears as a doo-wop monk. The new theme song refers to the show's questionable renewal and the missed Emmy nomination. Some songs are a quite interesting mix, such as Kylie Minogue as a queen in a gay bar that sings "Off with His Shirt," lyrics that are inspired by the Queen of Hearts rant and with the melody based on the hit "It's Raining Men." The TV show also contains some medieval elements such as heraldry, and it also refers to other audiovisual representations of the Middle Ages, either by treating similar topics, such as the critique of monarchy as a model in Monty Python that we see here on the left, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but also expanding it to state that their model is exclusive of some groups named here in the lower right corner, or by using the same tools such as camera angle to create an illusion and immediately to demystify it. Another point of reference is, of course, the Game of Thrones, whether through road signs, vague references to Seven Kingdoms Madalena wants to take over, or when in a dramatic scene Isabella's mother kills the tension of the song "It's a Good Day to Die" by saying "This isn't Game of Thrones." My favorite example of intermediality is what is usually known as the Bayeux tapestry, although it's actually an embroidery. This object has a long history of cinematic quotes, whether it is a paratext in the Chanson de Roland or an opening title sequence with Edmund Blackadder as a pleased archer who has just killed Harold. Disney also included this motif in its 1971 musical fantasy movie Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and there are also examples of it being incorporated into the story, like it was the case with the movie The Cid. The embroidery has served as a means to better understand visual and preprint culture. And in Galavant, we have another adaptation or a partial quote. When the hero meets his estranged father, a retired hero, who has been following his adventures and documenting them by stitching. So with all the subversion, self-referentiality, and intermediality, this TV show is onto something. It can be studied in a broader context, and the very fact the show was canceled makes us think of many incomplete or fragmentary works. So the open ending can be used for creative writing, complemented with medieval materials or other products of medievalism. Fantasy is unlimited in terms of possibilities, so this anything goes can be a powerful way to study the phenomenon of storytelling and movie making. For example, fantasy is a framework that most of the adolescents are familiar with, so classrooms should become creative venues to explore that horizon of expectation. In this context, it is not a coincidence that organized religion is absent or at the very margin, something that is a tendency in recent cinematic medievalism and, according to many, a reaction to the 80s and the 90s version of it, in which the church was crucial. This way, there is a clear evolution in the field, and as satirical as Galavant is, it obviously respects certain conventions and trends. In it, magic, potions, and herbs play a role in both seasons, while other fantasy concepts such as giants are demystified. The show's playful ways can help highlight the challenges of not only audiovisual and performative storytelling, but also of the concepts, constructs, and values that are not limited to previous eras. For example, its multi-layered world engages with the 21st century discourse on gender, psychology, nutrition, and other global trends, allowing us therefore to reflect upon and question our own culture as well. In Galavant, humor oscillates between forced expected puns and witty dialogues, but the show also tackles the question of humor evolution, such as yo mama and fart jokes as expressions of low-quality humor. However, the experimental format has some limitations. First of all, despite a strong start, the steadily declining viewership made the production team question the renewal, an issue that was often addressed in the second season. This show was a risky move to begin with, as its short episodes, they only last 15 minutes each, and the fact it was there to fill in for another show confirm. Unlike the carnivalesque Monty Python, Galavant was not going for the shocking impact. While it was refreshing, its oddness did not acquire a status of innovation that was needed for cult shows the writers were hoping it would become. At the same time, the cancellation prevented from responding to those reactions and finding solutions that would keep the audience entertained. This also raises the question of our consumption habits, as well as the question of the best suited format in a broader field of medievalism and parodies, but also as a product in the culture of consumption with the ABC studios belonging to the Walt Disney Company. According to an article in Wall Street Journal written by Jurgensen, Galavant might be the closest thing we'll ever have to a naughty Disney musical. It was rated PG, and they did try to joke about some fairy tale tropes, such as representing the first kiss between Isabella and Galavant as musty and with too much tea. However, to ridicule something also means to reinforce it. The show follows the Disney's ongoing play with the princess franchise that go from passive and asleep females to rebels and warriors. But Galavant does not really break with the canon of happy endings. The show was experimental and open in some ways, such as diversity of the cast, but it still closely followed the Disney aesthetics. The couples resemble the Disney animations awful a lot. Heteronormativity dominates, while the depiction of gay or queer figures remains stereotypical and passé. Gay men are dancing in the enchanted bar, and the anti-princess swaps spit with boys and girls, as she says, but the aesthetic of that scene is quite different, basically marginal. So while innovative in some ways, Galavant is also quite traditional in other aspects, leaving most of the audience wanting more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. This was really illuminating, and I think it opened another perspective how to approach, how to read these kind of more funny productions or a topic, that it has in different ways. I haven't seen Galavant, but I will definitely like to watch it now. Thanks to your paper, it was very illuminating. Now we will have our third paper and the last one of this panel from Pablo Crovetto. Good to see you, Pablo, because we lost you for a second at the beginning. Pablo Crovetto obtained his TEFL degree, which is, I believe, teaching English for foreigners, I think, license, at Instituto Superior del Profesorado Joaquin Victor Gonzalez, where he also completed a postgraduate degree in English history. Crovetto teaches social studies at secondary level institutions and English history at the same institution in the city of Buenos Aires, Argentina. He's also a speaking examiner for the University of Cambridge, so he brings a lot of different tasks and expertise. Today, Pablo will be talking about the use of Old English, and hence his paper title, The Use of Old English in 21st Century Entertainment Media. The digital floor is yours, Pablo.
Thank you very much, Renan. Give me a second. I have to share screen. There we go. Let me know if you can see this. I believe it's still loading. There we go. As we all know, Anglo-Saxon culture has been a major source of inspiration for the creation of different kinds of audiovisual material. What's interesting about the recreation of these worlds is the language they use. So my interest was in analyzing why different productions resort to the use of Old English. So this is the corpus I've decided to work with. This is what was accessible on the net, at least from Argentina. As we can see, we have a corpus of different movies and series that resort to Old English to a greater or lesser extent. And as I said before, my question was, why would they all use Old English? A first hypothesis, of course, points to the question of authenticity, especially when these productions aim at recreating a medieval setting. It seems logical that they would resort to Old English. However, these productions, not all these productions have to do with literally recreating medieval words. In many of these cases, we have fantasy or literary recreations. And I will argue today that there is an implicit connection between Old English and the supernatural, or at least a perceived connection between these two elements. So aimed at a modern audience, I will be starting with Vikings. Aimed at a modern audience, the TV series unfolds, of course, in modern English. However, in Vikings, we can see a few instances in which medieval languages are used. In particular, the use of Old English seems to be connected with the question of authenticity. Although the historical accuracy of the events portrayed in the series is rather questionable, the very occasions in which the language of the Anglo-Saxons is used appears to be connected with the idea of adding a certain level of credibility to the scenes. A good illustration of this can be seen from the beginning of the series. In the second episode of the first season, the audience is presented with a number of interactions among Northumbrian monks, which we can see in the first picture. They are in Lindisfarne right before the well-known Viking assault on the island. These exchanges could have perfectly fit the narrative in modern English, but the use of Old English tells us more about the identity of the people soon to be raided. They belong to an altogether different culture. And this is further reaffirmed, of course, by their clothes and their various Christian practices. A scene conceived in the same spirit can be seen in the second episode of season 2. This is the second picture, in which again, Anglo-Saxons interact in their own language. And this helps the audience distinguish the soon to be conquered inhabitants of the British Isles from the Norse characters, who in the series only speak Old Norse occasionally. I would like to point out that the use of Old English is restricted to very specific scenes. In fact, right after this scene, we see Egbert, King of Wessex, and he speaks perfect modern English. I think this was done for reasons of practicality. But again, I think it's worth mentioning these scenes because they help the audience perceive the series with a sense of realism. Something similar happens in The Last Kingdom. In The Last Kingdom, we do not see interactions or conversations in Old English. Old English is restricted to names and specifically the place names. So the series takes place in different parts in Anglo-Saxon England as well as Scandinavia. So every time the setting changes, the audience is provided with an Anglo-Saxon reconstruction of the name. Here I chose an example, Etherwich. And then the letters are rearranged to provide the modern equivalent. Undoubtedly, the aim of this technique is to provide the narrative with a certain solidity and credibility. This is further reinforced in the script, in which the characters refer to these places in their Anglo-Saxon reconstruction. Although along the series we might see some inconsistencies in this, but clearly the intention is to add, to give the series a certain solidity, as I said before. So moving on to the juicy part. As I said before, in the recreation of fantasy or literary worlds, the argument for of authenticity does not suffice to explain the use of Old English. Something interesting to explore this can be seen in The Two Towers. In The Two Towers, the audience is first presented with the kingdom of Rohan. The kingdom of Rohan stands out in Tolkien's narrative in that it bears many connections with the Anglo-Saxon world. And in fact, it is Old English that they speak. This is the language of the Rohirrim in Tolkien's narrative. However, in Jackson's production, this is not altogether clear. Well, firstly, because we don't see them interacting in Old English, and secondly, there is a scene in which Eomer is banished. This we can see in the first picture, and the document is produced in perfect modern English. Yes, it starts out, "Let it be known that." So the only scene that draws our attention to Old English is a funeral scene in which Eowyn sings a dirge in Old English. Why include Old English in this scene? So one aspect to take into consideration in order to answer this question is that of genre, I believe. There are a number of inherent characteristics to the dirge genre, such as expressing misery, sorrow, and idealization of the past, all of which are reflected in this funeral scene. Furthermore, of special importance in dirges is this sharp contrast between past and present, or then and now. And in order to draw this contrast, or rather emphasize it, Old English seems to be a fit choice in that it is evocative of a distant past. So to a modern audience, Old English might sound a bit harsh and raw, while at the same time hint a small degree of familiarity. A further aspect to take into account is the ritualistic nature of the whole scene. Language plays a major role in rituals, since it is intimately and essentially connected with the action context of a ritual, and is directly used in accomplishing ends of the ritual operation. Indeed, in a scene that is filled with silence, the poetic language sung plays a main role. So switching to Old English, together with the poetic chant, is a tool to transform the message into a divine event suitable to death. The divine nature of the chant is further strengthened by the background music and the soft, angelical, feminine voices supporting Eowyn's. Along the same lines of the supernatural, we can read the use of Old English in Beowulf. In this movie, Grendel and his mother are the ones that use Old English, and I believe Old English here is used as an extension of their nature. There are things that they share, but there are also some differences between these two characters. What they share is this monstrous nature that they have, but Grendel is depicted as this fiendish destroyer who's mostly out of control throughout the whole movie. In fact, many times his mother will try to calm him down. And his speech is mostly incomprehensible. On the other hand, Grendel's mother is a shapeshifter, which means that many times she takes on a human form. And throughout the movie, she becomes a sort of implicit translator, in that when they interact, she echoes what Grendel is saying in a form closer to modern English, or closer to what a modern audience would understand. So that is to say that the closer we get to humanity, or to human forms, the more comprehensible language becomes, and therefore closer to modern English. Whereas the closer you are to this monstrous being, the closer you are to form of Old English. So the underlying assumption seems to me that there is something not human about Grendel that is mirrored in the way he speaks. Therefore, he's assigned this non-comprehensible language, which is Old English, because he's this malevolent supernatural being. And last but not least, I would like to refer to Merlin, in which also there is, we can see many instances of Old English. As we all know, the matter of Britain has been recreated many times, and each of these recreations showed, well, a different version of this Welsh myth. BBC's Merlin is no exception in this respect. What is interesting about Old English here is that its use is restricted to spells. So throughout the narrative, we can listen to approximately 270 incantations in Old English. So why would a 21st century recreation of this wealth myth resort to Old English for spells? Definitely the answer to this question does not lie in the authenticity or historical accuracy, because if anything, there is a lack of this in these areas. But I think that in order to answer this question, it's important to understand a common trend in fantasy. Sorry, I'm making someone. A common trend in fantasy, which seems to be a very strong connection between all forms of language and magic, right? This is not something that we see exclusively in Merlin. If we think of Lewin's Earthsea Saga, in which characters must learn the Old Speech in order to master magic, or we think of Harry Potter and the use of Latin and Greek in the spells, or also in Aragon, in which they must learn the old tongue, the ancient tongue, in order to control magic. We can see that this is a common trend, and I believe the creators of Merlin use this as an extension of this idea. To conclude, as I said at the beginning, many times we will find cases in which authenticity is at stake, and therefore creators of series and movies resort to Old English. But at the same time, when it comes to literary and fantasy worlds, there seems to be an implicit connection between Old English and the supernatural, which is portrayed and interpreted in very different ways, which I think these productions have helped me illustrate.
Thank you, Pablo. This was really interesting, and I think very much forcing us to rethink about the usage of these languages, different, form of languages from different posts in these shows or productions. As I said, I worked with many scriptwriters and producers, and language is always, a big issue. They had to decide on what kind of form they had to use. So I think, yeah, this topic, I think, is worth discussing. Now, once again, thank you for all our presenters. Now we will take questions. Yes, this is better. Now we will take questions. You can write in the chat box. In the meantime, I would like to actually give the first round of questions to our presenters, whether they have any questions to each other or any comments. So anyone can take the first lead. You can use, of course, raise hand option, or just speak directly, since you are able to unmute yourself. Yes, Maria?
Well, I would just like, because we come all from different environments, so that is a great way to start. And I think what we all have is this topic of fidelity or authenticity, whether it is the language, whether it is the world that is being represented. So I'm just curious, because I do literary studies and we don't have that burden, or at least we don't have it. So I'm just curious as to how students react, and do they see that this is the only paradigm, or are there any other ways to approach, whether it is the language or the medieval words in movies, that are more helpful? So to both of them.
Okay, maybe Nuria would like to take on that question first.
Okay, how do they react in the lesson, during the lesson? Do you mean that? Okay, it depends on the student, and it depends on the fragment that we have seen, of course. But at first, when we did the brainstorming activity that you have seen with the words of that came out to mind about medieval society, they I expected a little more darkness in the answers, I confess it, and they reacted as they were not surprised at all, because I think that they were almost the same age, so they have received a similar culture. They watch the same TV series, the same movies, more or less, the most of them. Okay, and then during the classes of the view, during the view of the films and the videos, they were they are shy. So students are shy by nature, so they don't answer at first, and you have to provoke their answers. You have to ask them, what do you think about that thing that appears here? What do you think about the way that they are dressing? So after this first moment of timidity, we can say, they analyzed much better than I thought the videos. They realized that they are that filmmakers depict Middle Ages with some following sometimes some cliche, and it's true that at first they don't see them, but after some lessons, after some discourse about Middle Ages, they realized fast that that those cliches are represented over and over again in lots of films, in lots of series, and they learned to analyze it very well. I was surprised the first year that we have the project.
Pablo?
Yes, I agree with Nuria that this depends a lot on the students and the group and their interest, but mainly they seem to be quite interested in this deconstruction of the medieval world, right? Many times when they see a movie, they are very used to taking it as movies are serious, right? As truth. This is what happened, and this is just a representation of what happened. And they seem to be quite engaged when we start deconstructing all the elements that make up this narrative and the choices behind what we actually see on the screen, right? So yes, I agree with you, Nuria.
Any other questions among our panelists to each other?
Yes, Maria, I would like to ask you about the use of music in Galavant. Do you think that the use of music made the series more appealing with all these medieval topics that are somehow interpreted as harsh?
That's a good question, because the Disney is in the show, so you either like that or you don't. And in the second season, at some point, you kind of tend not to like it that much. And the songs are really great in terms of they are all new songs, so they actually they would release the song before the episode, so they did try to capitalize on it, which is also the model that Disney is familiar with. and I am curious. I plan to use it in the last part of this semester with my students because we will do theater plays. So this is where songs, irrelevant of what time you study, come into play and can be useful as for analytical purposes. But I am not sure. I also need to say, like, I'm an Iberianist, so this to me was more, I watched it for fun. A colleague, historian, showed me the series, so in that sense it was entertaining. His kids loved it, so I am also not sure what the audience is or was supposed to be. And I know that since they canceled the show, they were trying to get it as a play, as a musical. And that is also an interesting question about how suitable it was to be on the TV, knowing what we know about our own habits and tendencies and what we prefer or like or are used to seeing when it comes to the Middle Ages.
Thank you. I see that Francis have some comments. Francis, do you want to ask any question to our panelists? We can unmute you. Just a second.
Yeah. Give me a moment. I'll unmute you right now.
Okay, I'm set. Okay. No, it was just fun because I was watching the presentation on Galavant, which is why I put the Brady Bunch right in the first, because that is a jump around. The good American in me said, home! And I thought it was cute. But it is interesting, the play with the references to other shows, to it becomes kind of an etch-a-sketch, and I can understand that it would be tiring after a while, which is probably why it didn't hold as a series. There is a time where you really do have to get into the story itself. There's another aspect, is I believe the first scene you showed us is in Wells Cathedral in England. Now that's interesting because what is how they play with existing medieval structures and what we know of, what we see of the Medieval Ages, and then rebuild something else on it. But that I found that. Yes, I was comparing it to Camelot, and I find the Justine's response to what I was saying is actually is very apt. But it's interesting because you have the same problem, and the way the French think of it is much less. Let's make it into a crazy musical, Monty Python, but it is the same it's the same kind of attack in a way. I'll repeat my point. I do think one of the interesting thing about these three articles is the importance of deconstructing the imagery that we create of the Middle Ages, as opposed to what the Middle Ages really are. And that is important to remind. These are what we expect the Middle Ages to be it Beowulf, Zemeckis' Beowulf is not necessarily the same as other versions of the story. And when it comes to literature, the case of The Lord of the Rings is really interesting because you have, between the Middle Ages and the films, you have Tolkien, who was essentially a linguist. And as such, wrote, and he puts that in his presentation, my original inspiration for The Lord of the Rings was essentially linguistic. And I find that fascinating. In the fact that that is something that is lost in the Jackson adaptation, also in the old Bakshi cartoon, but that was a little bit, he didn't have the time to go into it. But I find that that is also a problem, that the fact that the language, as the other person pointed out, was that Old English would become something incomprehensible and not useful. It's not. That language in itself, it was the interaction of the various languages that makes the entire novel work. And it didn't. And none of the filmmakers ever felt that. Whereas in film, you can actually play with multilinguistic structures and how they try to play off against each other, how they translate one another, and how meanings change in translation. For any of us who are really bilingual, it's quite jolting at times, where you find yourself borrowing from one language to express an idea in another language. And if you have it in 3 or 4, it can feel quite hairy, in fact.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis. Indeed. I totally agree. This whole linguistic aspect of these shows, productions, I personally think, they got more sophisticated. getting more and more sophisticated in the way, they can, place the language or language-related issues, but also this whole educational aspect that Nuria mentioned. I totally agree that as this conference is a proof that more and more academic scholars are getting interested in audiovisual, world, and of course we are using those products. And so thank you so much. So I cannot see any questions. Oh wait, there's one, I think, a question from Andrew for Maria. Oh wait, so this will be just a sec. Maria, maybe you can also see the chat box. Is this a question? Yes. So I just quickly read it. It's such an excellent term. This was a self-referentiality for that complexity way that the cliches to which Professor Sánchez referred proliferate. I'm now wondering how, if we are able to tell which ones are unconscious cliches and which is self-referentiality. Did your students find anything like that, Professor Sánchez? Or did any of our speakers encounter ways to differentiate between them? So it's a question for all of us. Maria, or yeah, Maria can maybe start.
Yeah, sorry about that. Well, it's something to think about, and it's different. I teach in Vienna, so maybe some of my students watch Game of Thrones and maybe Lord of the Rings, but that's about it, I would say. So, what is? I mean, this immediately, the Brady Bunch. So, what are the references that we are familiar with, and what to do with them? I'm sure that none of my students would know that that was Brady Bunch reference. So in that sense, I think it's a scale, because what is a cliche for us? You need to get to a certain level of knowledge to understand something as a cliche. So when I deal with heroic epic, for example, of course, their body sliced in half and whatnot. So we as academics, I think, caused a lot of damage, because we used to read these texts as this is what they believed happened. And since we stepped away from that, I think we have a lot more liberty to discuss these things. And this is why I like Galavant in that way, that they also play with them, but they also play with them in their own terms. It's a Disney franchise, so there is this limit. And the cliches are there. And the question is, are we bothered by the cliches, or can we use them? I think micro stories, for example, flash fiction is also a great way to subvert tropes and to offer a 21st century version of a story. I don't know, Sleeping Beauty or something like that. So in that sense, I guess we get to decide also where on the scale we want to move and how to tip it.
Thank you. And Nuria, you want to?
I totally agree with Maria. And my students were not capable of distinguish this kind of variant of these two type of cliche. So I cannot add anything else here.
And Pablo?
I agree with Maria. I would like to add specifically when it comes to Old English, there seems to be a cliche that Old English is this obscure and incomprehensible language, right? And this was one of the problems that they had in Merlin, because when they worked on the spells, they found out that by saying words in isolation, Old English all of a sudden was not that obscure. So they had to reword the spells many times in order for the audience not to understand what was being said. The results of this, I don't know if it was that good, because there were many spells that a modern audience could have distinguished. I included the Drakas spell, which is definitely a dragon, and there's no arguing against that. But I do think that these cliches are what made many of these productions choose Old English as the language of magic or the supernatural, in the sense that because it seems obscure, uncontrollable, difficult, it matches magic, because magic is that mysterious, obscure force that only a few can control.
Thank you. Okay, I'm checking the chat box whether we have any questions. We have some comments, so people can also read them.
Maybe you have a question before we finish the panel, and it's a question that I would like to ask Pablo, considering what he mentioned about Old English. And I agree with him. Of course, I agree with you, Pablo, when you mentioned that Old English is used both as this type of mystic old language related to supernatural forces on the one hand, or on the other hand, used as an authenticity tool. I wanted to mention two of the cases that you mentioned. The first one is, of course, Vikings. And if one sees the series, normally when Old English appears, it is just a couple of sentences, and then they change to normal English. It happens the same when Vikings are talking about themselves and they are talking in Old Danish, I suppose it is. And I think that the message that the series sends is that one should assume that they are talking in those, that they're speaking in those languages, just that for practicality purposes, then they change to modern English, so as to make it understandable for everyone. But I think it's a very interesting use, because it's just kind of like to give something of an immersion window. This is how they should sound, and in your head they should continue to sound like this, but for practicality reasons we are just going to change to normal English. So it's something like a mental exercise that the show asks the viewer to keep in mind. That would be our first point. And the second one would be, of course, what you mentioned, for example, with the case of Tolkien. As Francis mentioned, Tolkien did begin his work as a linguist, coming first with the languages and then with the world. But the interesting thing, I think, with Old English is that it is the only quote-unquote historical language in the whole universe. And I think it's more interesting considering that Tolkien thought of his world as being something as a prehistory of our world. He does not conceive Middle Earth as being a fantasy realm. He's just considering it to be the story of the Earth, but many, many, many thousands of years ago, and we just kind of forgot it. So I would like to know what would be your opinion in the way in which these two uses of Old English, like this immersion window on the one hand that we are just assumed to take, on the other one, the insertion of a historical language in a completely fantasy landscape where no other historical languages are there.
Sorry. Yes, so as regards the first question, I completely agree. This is the technique, right? Just showing a few interactions. Sometimes they use the sandwich technique, in which first they speak Old English, then they speak modern English, then they switch to Old English again in Vikings. So yes, this is to keep the audience tuned to this other level that they should have in their heads when it comes to languages, especially Egbert, who appears a lot in the series, is not depicted speaking Old English at all. He speaks perfect modern standard English, British English, right? So yes, I think this is an exercise that the audience is asked to take on. And when it comes to the use of Old English in Tolkien's recreation, I think it's, I agree 100% with what you said, but I think it's important to read this as a second narrative. Although the movie is depicting Tolkien's world, this is Jackson's own recreation of this world, right? That's why I think he decided to do away with Old English in this document, the banning of Éomer, because probably he neglected to some extent the use of Old English in, let's say, everyday or formal documents in Rohan. But in the social imaginary, Old English holds this special place So that's why he decided to use it in the funeral scene, because it was evocative of all this supernatural power.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. Although I mean, I would also add that something, of course, that I suppose is unavoidable even for the movie is, for example, to keep the names. I'm not an expert in Old English, but as I understand it, the root "eo" means horse, and a lot of names in Rohan begin with "eo" and things.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. In that case, yes, it is unavoidable to do that. Yes, of course.
Well, thank you so much. Well, if this was happening in our, physical world together, I would be saying, okay, let's end the session and let's have some coffee and continue chatting each other. Now we cannot do that. Maybe next time we organize a conference, maybe we can have a coffee, like waiting room or something, so that people can continue. But thank you so much once again for our presenters. Nuria,
maybe
Marija,
just
and
one
Pablo.
final remark, and of course, if our panelists agree with it, please feel free to leave your email addresses in the chat box so people can write you emails with questions about your presentations. Okay, thank you.
Exactly. For further communication, that's also a nice way. So I'm personally very grateful for this panel. As always, I learned so much and now get interested in new shows. Now for our next panel, I will leave it to Carolina to inform you. And I wish you all the best, healthy minutes every time you take a breath. Best regards from Budapest.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for all the great presentations and the discussion. I would like to invite you for our next panel, On-Screen Abuses of the Middle Ages. And the panel will start at 3:30. The chair of this panel will be Professor Bauke van der Berg. Thank you.